On the southeastern shoulder of the high plateau that runs through the middle of the country, where the granite of the old shield weathers up out of the grassland in rounded gray domes and in long sheets of bare rock, there is a valley held between two heights, and in that valley and on the hill above it, the walls of a stone town still stand. The land here lies a little above 3,000 feet, high enough that the heat of the lowlands is softened and the nights of the dry season turn cold, low enough that the woodland holds its cover of masasa and mnando and the scattered flat crowns of the larger trees, and the country rolls away in every direction in a long sequence of grass and rock and thin standing timber toward horizons that are never quite flat. The granite is the first fact of the place, older than anything that walked on it, lifted and worn through ages until it broke into the shapes the builders later used. The great whaleback domes that shed the rains in sheeting falls, the balanced boulders left standing where the softer rock around them wore away, the flat exfoliated slabs that peeled from the dome faces in the heat and the cold and lay ready on the ground. Water gathers here in the wet months and drains away in the dry, the small streams running down from the high ground toward the Save and the Lowveld beyond, cutting their shallow courses through the red and gray soils, holding in pools through the early dry season, and then thinning to damp sand by the height of the cold months when the grass has gone pale and the leaves have fallen from the woodland. The hill that stands over the valley rises something near 80 meters above the floor, a steep mass of granite, broken into terraces and clefts and crowned with great boulders. And from its summit the country opens in a wide circle, the woodland and the grassland and the other granite hills standing out of it at intervals like the backs of animals half buried in the ground. Below the hill, the valley floor spreads broad and gentle, and it was here, on the open ground between the heights, that the largest of the stone walls were raised, in a place with water near at hand and grazing all around, and the granite of the slopes supplying the stone within an easy carry. The climate turns on a single season of rain, the storms building up through the late spring afternoons and breaking in the warm months from about October, and then a long dry stretch through the cold middle of the year, when the skies stand clear and the grass cures on the stem and the cattle are driven toward the standing water. The soils of the valley are workable, granite sands and the heavier red earths in the lower ground, good enough for the sorghum and the millet that fed the town, and the grass of the surrounding country was the true wealth of the place, the wide grazing that carried the cattle herds whose numbers were the measure of standing here. There is no great river at Great Zimbabwe, no harbor, no pass that funnels the traffic of a region through one gate. There is only the high open country and the granite and the grass, and a position on the plateau from which the gold of the reefs to the west and the cattle of the grasslands all around could be gathered and held and sent on toward the distant coast. The wind moves across the high ground through most of the year, dry and steady in the cold months, and it carries the smell of cured grass and dust, and, in the wet season, the heavier scent of wet earth and new growth, and over all of it the granite stands gray and warm and unchanged, holding the heat of the day long into the evening. The high ground carried its own advantages of health as well as of grazing, for the elevation held the worst of the lowland fevers at a distance, and kept the tsetse fly of the hot valleys away from the cattle, so that the herds that were the wealth of the place could be kept and bred and grown where the lower country would have thinned them, and the people who depended on the herds prospered in the same air. The woodland of the slopes and the open country held its game, the small antelope of the thickets and the larger grazers of the grassland, the guinea fowl and the francolin in the cover. And beyond the immediate country, down the long descent toward the Lowveld, the elephant whose ivory moved east along the same roads as the gold. The granite itself ran in a broad belt across this part of the plateau, the same rock that gave the building stone also holding, in the quartz reefs that threaded it, and in the gravels of the streams that drained it, the gold that drew the distant trade, so that the position of the town stood at the meeting of the building stone and the grazing grass and the gold fields, the three supports of its greatness gathered into one stretch of high country. To the south and west, the land fell away toward the country of Mapungubwe, the older center near the great river junction, where the same kind of order had risen and passed a century or two before, so that Great Zimbabwe stood as the inheritor and the greater successor of a way of building wealth and rule that the plateau had already learned. This was the ground the builders chose, not for any single advantage of river or road, but for the meeting it allowed. The high, healthy country where cattle thrived, and the streams ran clean, and the stone lay ready on the hillsides. And it is on this ground, between the hill and the valley floor, in the long light of the plateau evenings, that the walls were raised and still remain. The walls were built without mortar, of granite blocks trimmed roughly to a brick-like shape and laid in level courses, each block resting on the weight and friction of the blocks below it. And the largest of these freestanding walls rose more than 11 meters from the ground and stood over 5 meters thick at the base, tapering as they climbed so that the mass narrowed toward the top and held its own weight in a long stable batter. The stone itself came from the granite of the surrounding hills, where the builders set fires against the dome faces and then doused them, splitting the rock along its natural sheeting into flat slabs that could be broken down further into the coursing blocks, so that the quarrying and the building where the same work continued, the hillside yielding the material that the wall consumed. There are two great concentrations of this masonry, and they answer each other across the valley. On the granite summit stands the hill complex, the older of the two, its walls woven in and out among the natural boulders, so that built stone and living rock run together, closing the clefts and roofing nothing, raising screens and passages and enclosures across the broken top of the hill, reached from below by stepped paths that climb through the rock in narrow ascending ways. On the valley floor stands the great enclosure, the largest single structure, an outer wall that curves around in a great rough circle some 90 meters across, the wall itself running for well over 240 meters and standing at its highest more than 9 meters, enclosing within it a quieter ground of inner walls and passages and the daga houses that once filled the space. Along the upper course of the finest stretch of the great enclosure wall runs a band of chevron patterning, the blocks set in a herringbone of dark and light that bands the top of the wall for a long run of its length, the one clear ornament on masonry that is otherwise plain, and the labor of it, the selection and setting of each block to hold the pattern across the curve, marks the wall as the work of a settled and confident tradition. Within the great enclosure, reached down a long, narrow passage that runs between the outer wall and an inner one, the ground rises to a solid conical tower, built up of coursed granite into a rounded mass, something near 10 meters high and perhaps 5 across at the base, without door or window or interior of any kind, a thing built to be seen and not entered, tapering smoothly toward its worn summit. The houses that stood among and within the stone were not of stone at all, but of daga, a puddled and rammed mixture of granite, gravel, and clay that was built up into low curving walls and into the floors and platforms and hearths of the household, finished smooth and sometimes molded into low benches and basins, and roofed with conical frames of poles and thatch that the stone walls never carried. So the stone defined the spaces of the town without enclosing them overhead, marking off the household from the passage and the elite ground from the common, drawing the lines of standing and approach across the hill and the valley, while the life of the place went on under thatch in rooms of molded earth. The coursing of the walls changes across the site and across time. The earliest work laid in rougher, uncoursed blocks gathered as they came, the finest work in carefully trimmed and leveled courses that hold their lines unbroken around the long curves. And archaeologists read the growth of the town in these styles, the masonry maturing from a practical raising of screens into the assured high curving walls of the central period. Nowhere in all of it is there an arch or a vault or a true corner. The builders worked in curves and in long straight runs, and in the wrapping of wall around boulder, in the tapering batter that let a dry wall stand to its full height without binding, and in the patient accumulation of level courses, and from these few means they raised the largest stone structures of the southern half of the continent. Beyond the two great concentrations, the valley between them held a scatter of smaller enclosures, the so-called valley ruins, clusters of curving walls that ringed the daga houses of households of standing, each enclosure its own walled ground with its narrow entrance and its inner court, so that the settlement was not two buildings but a whole town of walled compounds spread across the floor between the hill and the heights, the greater and the lesser marked off from one another in the same dry stone language. The entrances through the walls were kept low and narrow, some of them rounded at the jambs, and once spanned by timber or stone lintels, and floored with worn sills. The passages turning so that no entrance gave a straight view into the ground beyond, the approach controlled and screened at every gate. Within the walls the builders set tall, thin monoliths of dressed stone upright along the wall tops and on the platforms, slender uprights standing above the coursing, and on the hill complex these monoliths carried the carved birds, while elsewhere they stood plain, marking and crowning the grounds they rose from. The daga of the houses was worked with care, the floors laid smooth and sometimes burnished and reddened, molded up at the edges into low benches and into the raised surrounds of the hearths, divided by low curving cross walls into the spaces of the household, the sleeping floor and the cooking floor and the store. And outside the houses, the daga was carried into platforms and into the low walls of stock pens and grain bin stands. Drains were built through the bases of some of the walls to carry the wet season water off the enclosed grounds. Small stone-lined channels run through the coursing at ground level, the builders attending to the shedding of the heavy rains that the granite gathered. The walls were not defenses in any military sense, too low in places and too open in their many narrow entrances to hold against a determined attack, and they are better read as the marking of authority and of separation, the enclosing of the households that mattered and the spaces that were kept, the building in permanent stone of distinctions that the daga houses alone could not have held. What the builders made, they made to stand, and it has stood, the granite courses holding their lines and their batter and their chevron band through the centuries since the last of the daga fell back into the soil. The day began with the cattle. In the gray light before the sun cleared the eastern rim of the valley, the herders were already moving among the enclosures where the beasts had stood through the night, counting them by sight and by the calls they knew, opening the ways and letting the herds out through the narrow stone and timber gates into the cool of the early grazing. And the soft, heavy movement of cattle and the calling of the herd boys was the first sound of the settlement after the birds. Cattle were the center of the economy and the measure of wealth and standing, the count of a household's herd standing for its place in the order of the town. And so the morning movement of the beasts out toward the grass was the most important work of the day, attended and watched and carried out under the eyes of the men whose position rested on the herds. In the households among and below the walls, the fires were rekindled from the embers banked in the daga hearths through the night, the ash raked back and the coals fed with twigs until the flame caught, and the women set to the grinding of grain, kneeling to the lower stone and working the upper stone back and forth across it, crushing the sorghum and the finger millet into the coarse meal that the day's food was made from, the querns worn over years into smooth, deep basins in the granite. The smell of wood smoke rose along the narrow passages between the walls and gathered in the still morning air, mixing with the smell of cattle and cured grass and the damp of the daga floors. And the children carried water up from the streams in pots, balanced and steadied as they climbed the paths, the water drawn from the pools that held longest into the dry season and growing more distant as the season wore on. The work of the morning was the work of the household and the field, unhurried and known, each part of it carried in the same way it had been carried by the generations whose walls still stood around the living. And there was little in it that the people of the town would have called remarkable. In the planting season, the men and women went out from the settlement to the fields in the valley soils, hoeing the ground with iron-bladed hoes, hafted to wooden handles, breaking the earth and setting the seed of the sorghum and the millet and the cowpeas and the ground beans that grew alongside the grain, and the fields ran out from the edges of the settlement into the cleared ground between the thing woodland. The potters worked in the mornings while the light was good and the air still cool, building up their vessels by hand in coils of clay, and smoothing and burnishing the surfaces with smooth stones to the dark luster that the finer wares carried, the large pots for water and for grain and for the brewing of beer, the smaller burnished bowls for serving and for eating. Among the upper terraces and the enclosed grounds, the households of the elite kept a different mourning, their grain ground by others and their water carried for them, their standing marked by the finely coursed walls that closed their houses off from the press of the valley, and the imported beads and cloth that came up the long roads from the coast were worn and held among these households as the visible signs of a position that rested on cattle and gold and the control of the trade. Smiths kept their forges at the edges of the settlement, where the danger of fire was held away from the thatch, drawing iron from the bloomery furnaces into hoes and axes, and the points of arrows and spears, and the working of gold, hammered and drawn into thin wire, and beaten into thin sheet and wound onto cores, went on in the same quiet, specialist way, the metal gathered from the reefs and the river gravels of the plateau and turned into ornament and into the wealth that moved toward the coast. The children carried the lighter labor of the morning, the herding of the smaller stock, and the scaring of the birds from the ripening fields with slings and with calling, the carrying of water and of firewood gathered from the thinning woodland around the town, the watching of younger children, and in this work the order of the place was learned early, the counting of cattle and the tending of the fields passing from the old to the young in the ordinary motions of the day. Women bore the greater part of the grain work, the grinding at the querns that filled the early hours with its steady rocking sound, the cooking at the hearths, the brewing of the beer that stood in the great pots, the carrying and the storing, the making and the smoothing of the daga that the houses were built and floored from, the daughters working beside the mothers as the sons worked beside the fathers among the herds. The variety of the fields was wide, the sorghum and the finger millet as the staple grains, the bulrush millet in the drier ground, the cowpeas and the ground beans and the gourds and the melons set among the grain. so that the morning labor of the planting season spread the households across a patchwork of crops in the valley soils, the hoeing and the weeding and the guarding going on through the warm, wet mornings under the building cloud. By the time the sun stood well up over the valley, the herds were out on the grass, and the fields were full of working people, and the smoke of the cooking fires had thinned, and the town settled into the long middle of its day, the granite walls warming in the climbing light, the work of grinding and hoeing and building and herding going on across the hill and the valley, in the steady, unremarkable way that filled the great length of the settlement's life. The first material of Great Zimbabwe was the granite under it and around it, the pale gray biotite granite of the plateau that had stood through unmeasured ages, and that the builders turned to their use with fire and water and the wedge. Heated by fires laid against the rounded dome faces, and then suddenly cooled, the rock split along the planes of its own sheeting, peeling away in the flat slabs that the granite forms as it weathers. And these slabs were broken down with hammerstones into the rough rectangular blocks that the walls were coursed from, so that the stone needed no quarrying in the deep sense, only the encouragement of a splitting it was already inclined toward. The granite gave the town its permanence and its color, the long curving walls gray under the sun and warming to a soft gold in the low light of evening, and the same stone underfoot, the bare domes and sheets that the settlement was set among, so that the built and the natural rock ran together throughout the place. The daga that filled the spaces, the stone defined, was a second earth material, a worked mixture of decomposed granite, gravel, and clay puddled with water, and built up wet into the walls and floors and hearths and platforms of the houses, rammed and smoothed and left to harden, and in the firing of accidental burning, some of it took on the durability of low pottery, so that the molded floors and the hearth surrounds and the low benches survive in the ground, where the perishable poles and thatch above them have long gone. The potters drew their clay from the valley deposits and built their vessels by hand, raising the walls in coils and paddling and scraping them to an even thickness, burnishing the leather-hard surface with a smooth pebble to a close, dark sheen, and firing them in open hearths or shallow pits where the flame and the smoke gave the wares their color, the heavier pots for storage and brewing and the carrying of water, the finer burnished bowls, graphite dark and smooth for the serving of food. Iron was won from the ironstone of the region in clay bloomery furnaces, blown with bellows through clay nozzles. The ore and the charcoal layered and burned down to a spongy bloom of metal that was then hammered hot to drive out the slag and consolidate it. And from this iron, the smiths made the hoes that broke the fields, the axes that cleared the woodland, the knives and the points and the wire and the bells, the working tools and weapons of the settlement. Gold, the material that drew the long roads to the coast, came from the quartz reefs of the plateau and from the gravels of the streams that drained them, won by the digging of shallow shafts into the reefs and by the washing of the river sands, and it was worked cold and soft, drawn into fine wire and beaten into thin foil and wound onto cores of other material, made into beads and bangles, and the thin ornament that the elite households held, and gathered above all as the dense portable wealth that traveled east. Copper and bronze came in along the same roads or from sources to the north and west, drawn into wire and cast into the ingots, some of them shaped like a long cross, that served as a store and a measure of value across the wider region, and these too were worked into the ornament of standing. Soapstone, soft and gray-green and easily carved, was worked into shallow dishes with patterned rims and, most distinctively, into the standing bird figures. 8 of them recovered from the hill complex, each carved at the top of a tall monolith, and combining the body and stance of a bird with details that read as neither wholly raptor nor wholly human, the feet and the lips and the posture carrying human elements into the form of a bird. Bone and ivory were worked as well. The bone of the cattle and the game made into points and awls, and the small tools of the household and into divining pieces. The ivory of the elephant carved into bangles and ornaments, and gathered above all in the raw for the trade east. The tusks moving down the long roads toward the coast alongside the gold. The spindle whorls of fired clay and of reworked potsherd, round and pierced at the center, are found through the settlement, and show the spinning of thread and the weaving of cotton cloth on the plateau, a craft of the household that turned the fiber into the cloth that clothed the people, and marked, in its finer weaves and its imported lengths, the standing of those who wore it. The glass of the imported beads was itself a material the people reworked, the beads sometimes ground down and remelted and drawn anew into the forms the local taste preferred, so that the ocean trade supplied not only the finished ornament, but the raw glass for a craft of the town. Iron was made not only into tools, but into the gongs and the bells and the slender ceremonial blades that belonged to the order of rule and ritual. Double iron gongs of a kind known widely across the continent, recovered from the high enclosures, the metal carrying meaning as well as use, the smith's work standing at the meeting of the practical and the sacred. Wood and fiber and hide filled out the material life of the place, and have mostly gone from the ground, the poles and thatch of the roofs, the wooden hafts and bowls and headrests, the baskets and the mats and the cordage, the cattle hides and the woven cotton cloth, that the imported spindle whorls and the documentary record both attest, the soft materials that clothed and furnished the life, the stone, and the metal frame for the archaeology. From granite and earth and clay and iron and gold and soft gray stone, won mostly from the immediate country and worked by hands trained in long tradition, the people of the town made the whole of their settled world, and it is in these materials, the ones that endured, that the world is read. Great Zimbabwe stood at the inland end of a reach of exchange that ran for many hundreds of kilometers, from the high grasslands of the plateau, down the long descent to the Lowveld, and across to the towns of the Swahili coast, to Sofala on the nearer shore and beyond it to Kilwa, and through those coastal towns into the wider trade of the Indian Ocean that bound the eastern coast of Africa to Arabia and Persia and India, and by further relays to China. What went east from the plateau was above all gold and ivory, the gold won from the reefs and the river gravels and gathered at the inland centers, the ivory taken from the elephant of the Lowveld and the plateau margins, dense and portable wealth that repaid the long carry to the coast, and these were moved not by any single road or caravan, but by relays of porters, and by the slow movement of goods from hand to hand and center to center down the descending country toward the sea. What came back inland is held in the ground of the town in unmistakable form, glass beads in great quantity and in many colors, drawn and wound beads carried in from the Indian Ocean workshops and traded up the country in such numbers that they became the common currency of ornament, fragments of Chinese stoneware and of the pale green celadon, whose glaze and form mark it as the work of distant kilns, sherds of Persian and Near Eastern glazed and painted pottery, and a coin struck at Kilwa on the far coast, carried all the way inland to the stone town on the plateau. The presence of these things in the heart of Great Zimbabwe, in the elite grounds among the finest walls, shows the town not as a place apart, but as the gathering point of a system, the center on the plateau where the gold of a wide country was assembled and the goods of the ocean were received and held and redistributed, the standing of the rulers resting in part on their control of this gathering and this giving out. The trade rested on cattle as much as on gold, For the herds were the wealth that moved the labor and fed the porters, and stood behind the whole order of the place, and the gold and the cattle together, the dense wealth that traveled and the living wealth that stayed and grew, were the twin supports of a settlement that drew the produce of a wide plateau toward one center. The roads themselves left little in the ground, being only the worn ways across the grass and through the woodland that the porters and the cattle followed, threading from center to center down the long fall of the land toward the coast. Easier in the dry months when the ground was hard and the rivers low, and harder in the wet when the lowveld turned to mud and the streams ran full, so that the rhythm of the long trade followed the rhythm of the seasons. Cotton cloth came in along these roads and was made on the plateau as well. The spindle whorls of fired clay and worked sherd found through the settlement showing the spinning of thread, and cloth and beads, and the imported ceramics and the worked metal were the goods of standing, gathered and worn, and given by the households whose position rested on the control of the exchange. The mechanics of the long trade were those of relay and of redistribution, rather than of any single merchant carrying goods the whole distance, the gold and the ivory passing from the gatherers of the plateau to the holders of the center, and from them down the descending country, through intermediate places to the coastal towns, each stage taking its share, the Swahili merchants of Sofala and Kilwa handling the seaward end where the goods of the plateau met the dhows of the monsoon trade. Cowrie shells from the ocean came inland along the same routes, and the glass beads in their tens of thousands became so common in the ground of the town that they stand as the clearest single sign of the reach of the trade. The small drawn and wound beads of blue and green and yellow and red, carried up from the coastal workshops and the workshops of the Indian Ocean beyond. The control of this exchange was a foundation of the ruler's authority, for the imported goods were not freely available, but came in through the center and were given out from it. The beads and the cloth and the porcelain distributed downward as the marks of favor and of place, so that the order of standing in the town was bound up with the flow of the ocean's goods through the hands of those who held the height. The town did not stand alone in this, but at the head of a system of lesser centers, scattered across the plateau and its margins, smaller stone-walled places that gathered the gold and the ivory of their own districts and forwarded them toward the Great Valley, so that Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a reach of country and not merely a single rich town, the largest node in a web of exchange that bound the high grassland to the distant sea. The system was old before Great Zimbabwe rose to its height, the gold of the plateau having moved toward the coast for centuries through earlier centers, and the town's greatness was in good part the drawing of this established trade toward itself, the concentration at one place on the high country of the gathering and forwarding that had before been more widely spread. And the same trade that built the town would, in the end, move away from it, the routes and the centers shifting north toward the Zambezi as the generations passed, the gathering point migrating to the rising power of Mutapa, so that the wealth that the long roads carried, which had raised the walls and filled the grounds with beads and porcelain, drew off at last toward other hills, and the granite town was left holding the stone that the trade had paid for. Toward the end of the afternoon, the movement of the day reversed itself, and the cattle that had gone out at dawn came back across the grass toward the enclosures, the herders bringing them down the worn ways in the long light, the dust rising gold behind the moving herds, and the calling of the beasts, and the boys carrying again across the valley as it had at morning. The counting was done once more as the cattle came in, the herds folded into their stone and timber enclosures for the night, against the cold and against the predators of the dark country, and the men who standing rested on the beasts watched them in as they had watched them out, so that the day was bracketed at both ends by the movement of the wealth that the whole settlement was ordered around. In the households, the fires were built up again from the day's low coals as the air began to cool. The cold of the dry season evenings settling quickly once the sun was off the land, and the second and larger meal of the day was made, the thick porridge of sorghum or millet meal, cooked in the big pots and served with a relish of greens or beans, or, in the households that could keep it, the meat of a beast killed for some occasion. Beer brewed from millet stood fermenting in the large pots and was drunk in the evenings, sour and thick and mildly strong, shared in the gatherings of men, and poured in the observances owed to the ancestors. And the brewing and the keeping and the giving of beer was itself a part of the order of standing, the households of position marked by what they could brew and pour and share. The light failed quickly, as it does in those latitudes, the sun going down behind the western domes, and the gold draining off the granite walls into gray and then into the dark, and the chevron band along the top of the great wall held the last of the light a moment after the lower courses had gone into shadow, the pattern legible against the fading sky until that too was gone. In the upper terraces and the enclosed grounds, the elite households took their evening apart from the press of the valley, their food prepared and carried for them, their grounds closed off behind the finest of the coursed walls, and the imported beads and the worn cloth and the held ornament that marked their position were the quieter signs of an evening different in its comfort and its separation from the evenings of the valley below. The evening was the time of gathering, the men of a compound coming together over the beer in the cooling air, the talk of the herds and the fields, and the standing of households carried low across the courts, the affairs of the town settled and remembered in speech rather than in writing. For the people kept their account and their history in the spoken word and in the memory of the line, the genealogies and the claims and the old movements of the families held in the telling. The pouring of a little beer to the ancestors belonged to these gatherings. The dead of the household acknowledged before the living drank, the hearth and the gathering ground standing as the near end of the same order whose far end was the carved birds on the hill, so that the ordinary evening carried its thread of the sacred without ceremony or remark. The cold came down hard in the dry season evenings once the sun was off the land, and the fires were drawn close and the hides and the cloth brought out, the households gathering in around the warmth, the smaller children carried in to sleep, the old sitting nearest the coals, and the granite of the walls gave back into the cold air the heat it had taken through the day, so that the lee of a great wall was a warmer place to sit than the open ground. The dogs of the settlement moved among the compounds in the dark, and the cattle shifted and breathed in their pens, and from the hill above the dark mass of the oldest walls stood over the valley where the fires showed in the openings of the houses, the smoke standing up straight in the still cold air toward the hard bright stars of the dry season sky. Along the narrow passages between the walls, the smoke of the cooking fires rose again and gathered, the smell of porridge and wood smoke and cattle and the cooling earth, and the sounds of the settlement drew inward and softened, the voices of the households low under the thatch, the occasional call across the dark, the shifting of the cattle in their pens, the small noises of a town settling towards sleep. The same place that the morning had filled with the work of grinding and hoeing and herding was filled now with the quiet of the evening meal and the gathering of households, the same period of the settlement's long life seen from its other end, the rising of the day answered by its closing. And in the repetition of these mornings and evenings, each so like the last across the years, the real substance of the town's life was carried. The children were gathered in from the passages and the edges of the settlement, the last water set by for the night, the entrances drawn closed, and the people lay down in the daga houses on their mats and their hides with the wooden headrests under their necks, while outside the granite walls stood holding the warmth of the day a little longer than the air around them, gray and solid in the starlight over the sleeping valley. And the hill above, where the oldest walls wove among the boulders, and the carved birds stood in their high enclosures, stood dark over the settlement through the night. The whole place quiet under the cold, clear sky of the dry season, the cattle still in their pens, the fires banked low to be raised again before the next dawn, the rhythm closing and waiting to open once more. The most restricted ground of Great Zimbabwe was the high ground, the summit of the hill where the oldest walls wove among the great boulders and closed the clefts into a sequence of enclosures and screened passages reached by the narrow stepped ways that climbed through the rock. The approach itself was part of the ordering, the paths rising steeply between boulders and built walls, so that the climb to the upper enclosures was slow and single file and overlooked, the ground arranged so that those who came up under the eyes of those who held the height, and the spaces at the top were the most enclosed and the most apart of the whole settlement. It was on this hill that the carved soapstone birds stood, 8 of them recovered from the enclosures of the summit. Each worked at the top of a tall monolith of the soft gray-green stone, set upright into platforms and into the tops of walls. Standing over the enclosed grounds, the bird forms with their folded wings and their upright stance, carrying details that read as part raptor and part human. The figures most often understood as representations of the ancestors of the ruling line, the dead made present in worked stone above the ground of the living. The conical tower in the great enclosure below answered this high sacred ground from the valley floor, a solid mass of coursed granite without entrance or interior, built up smooth and tapering, and meant to be seen and approached but never entered. Its form most often read as that of a grain bin raised to a great size, an emblem of the stored harvest and of the ruler's role as the holder of plenty and the guarantor of the fertility of the land. In the order of the place rule and the sacred were not divided. The same walls that marked off the elite households, marking off the grounds where authority of every kind was held, the ruler standing at the meeting of the living order and the order of the ancestors, the giver of cattle and the receiver of tribute, and the figure through whom the dead and the powers of the land were addressed. The observances of the household ran alongside the high ritual of the hill, the pouring of beer to the ancestors at the hearth and the gathering ground, the keeping of the headrests and the small things of the dead, the small daily acknowledgments of the line of the family that ran back into the same ground, the great enclosures formalized, so that the worship of the ancestors moved without a break from the household hearth to the carved birds on the summit. Divination and the addressing of the powers of rain and fertility belonged to this same order, the rain that the single wet season brought, being the thing the whole settlement depended on, and the ruler's standing was bound to the coming of the rains and the fatness of the cattle and the filling of the grain bins, so that the great solid tower in its enclosure, raised in the form of the bin, stood as the visible claim that the order of the town and the plenty of the land were held together in one authority. The grounds of the hill kept things that mattered, the imported beads and the worked gold and the iron gongs and the soapstone gathered in the enclosures of the summit where the birds stood, and the concentration of these things in the high restricted ground shows the binding of wealth and worship and rule into a single ordered height that overlooked the whole valley. Divination belonged to this order as well, the casting and the reading of the worked bone and ivory pieces, the seeking of the will of the ancestors and the causes of sickness and misfortune, the specialist knowledge held by those whose standing rested on the addressing of the unseen, and the iron gongs recovered from the high enclosures, the double bells of a kind carried across much of the continent as the emblems of authority belonged to this same binding of rule and ritual in the hands of those who held the height. Cattle entered the sacred order as well as the economic. The beasts given and slaughtered at the observances owed to the ancestors and at the gatherings of the household and the court. The herds that were the measure of wealth, standing also as the matter of sacrifice and feast, so that the same animals that the morning sent out to graze were the substance of the evening's rite when the occasion called for it. The monoliths that stood along the walls and on the platforms, plain and carved alike, raised the worked stone above the coursing into the upright forms that marked the sacred grounds, and the birds at the tops of theirs stood over the enclosures, as the presences of the line, set where the approach was hardest and the screening closest, the figures looking out over the country the rulers held. There was no temple in the sense of a roofed house of a god, no image of a deity set up to be served, but rather a graded landscape of enclosure and approach, in which the further and higher and more screened a ground was, the more it belonged to the holders of authority and to the presence of the ancestors, the sacred built into the same dry stone language as the rest of the town and reaching its concentration on the granite summit. And so the ritual of the place was woven through its stone, in the steep guarded approaches, in the birds standing over the high enclosures, in the great closed tower rising in the form of the harvest from the valley floor, the whole settlement arranged so that the order of the living and the order of the dead and the powers that brought the rain and the grass were held together in the gray granite above the grazing country. The year on the plateau turned on a single season of rain, and everything in the life of the town followed the coming and the going of the water. Through the warm months from about October, the storms built up over the high country in the long afternoons, the cloud rising white and then darkening and breaking at last over the domes and the valley in heavy falls that ran sheeting off the bare granite and gathered into the streams and stood in the pools and soaked into the worked soils of the fields, and the dry pale country greened almost at once, the grass coming up green and thick, and the woodland leafing and the cattle fattening on the new growth. This was the planting time. The men and women out in the valley fields with their iron hoes breaking the wet ground and setting the seed of the sorghum and the finger millet and the cowpeas and the ground beans. The work of the fields heaviest in these warm, wet months, when the rain made the planting and the weeding and the guarding of the ripening grain against the birds, the great labor of the settlement. The cattle thrived in the wet season, the herds spreading out over the green country under the herd boys, the beasts calving and fattening, the milk coming in, the wealth of the town growing on the grass, and the rhythm of the herding eased a little as the grazing came up close and abundant all around the valley. Then through the cooler months from about April, the rains drew off and the long dry season settled over the plateau, the skies clearing to a hard pale blue, the nights turning cold so that frost could touch the low ground, the grass curing on the stem from green to gold to pale brittle straw, the leaves falling from the woodland, the streams thinning back from their full courses toward the standing pools and the damp sand of their beds. This was the harvest and the storing, the ripe heads of sorghum and millet cut and carried in and threshed on the cleared ground and winnowed in the wind and stored in the raised bins against the long dry months and the next year's planting, the grain that the great tower stood as the emblem of gathered now, in fact, into the granaries of the households. In the dry months, the cattle had to be worked harder, the cured grass thinner, and the water more distant, the herds driven further toward the pools and the streams that still held, the herd boys ranging wider over the pale country, and the dry season was also the season of the long trade, the roads hard and the rivers low and passable, so that the porterage of gold and ivory toward the distant coast and the carrying of beads and cloth inland moved best in these clear, cold months. The granite shaped the seasons as much as the seasons shaped the town. The great domes, shedding the wet season rains in their sheeting falls down into the streams and the pools, so that the bare rock gathered and delivered the water that the soils alone would not have held. The same rock standing warm in the dry season sun and cold in the dry season nights, holding the heat of the short winter days into the evening and giving it up to the cold dark. The grain bins stood through the dry season as the store against the lean months, the raised structures of daga and timber and thatch, holding the threshed sorghum and millet off the ground and away from the damp and the vermin, and the great solid tower in the enclosure, raised in the form of the bin, stood through the same season as the emblem of this storing, the claim that the harvest of the land was gathered and held under the order of the ruler. The dry months were also the season of building and of repair. The labor freed from the fields turned to the raising and the mending of the walls, the quarrying of the granite by fire on the dome faces easiest in the dry, clear weather, the carrying and the coursing of the stone going forward, while the ground was hard and the rains held off, so that the great walls grew in the seasons when the fields did not need the hands. The herds were the thread that ran unbroken through both halves of the year, fattening on the wet season grass, and worked harder over the dry season distances, calving and milking, and being counted in and out, the wealth that did not sleep with the fields, and the movement of the cattle toward the standing water in the late dry season drew the herd boys far out over the pale country in the hardest stretch of the year, before the first storms of the next wet season brought the grass up green again and closed the circle. The two halves of the year gave the settlement two faces, the green crowded working face of the wet months with the fields full and the cattle spread fat over the country, and the storms standing over the domes, and the pale open face of the dry months with the grass cured and the harvest in the bins, and the herds drawn toward the water, and the long roads busy with the trade. And the town lived in the turning between them, year upon year, the rains coming and the grass greening and the grain ripening and the dry coming on again. And over all the years of the settlement's height this turning held, the single season of rain arriving and withdrawing, the granite shedding and storing the water, the cattle fattening and being driven to the pools, the grain filling the bins under the standing tower, the whole long life of the place carried on the slow, reliable wheel of the plateau's one wet season and its long, cold dry. By about the middle of the 15th century, the great walls were no longer the center they had been, and the people who had gathered around them in their thousands moved away across the plateau to other ground. There was no fall, in the sense the word usually carries, no burning, no sack, no sudden ending, written in a layer of destruction across the site. The settlement emptied rather than ended, the households dispersing over a span of time, the daily life of the valley and the hill thinning and drawing off, until the stones stood among grounds that were no longer full. The reasons read in the ground and in the country around are unspectacular and several, and they work together over time rather than striking at once. A dense settlement gathered around one center for 3 centuries, pressed hard on the land that fed it, the grazing of the great cattle herds eaten down, the woodland cut back for the fires, and the building and the smelting until the firewood had to be carried from further and further. The soils of the nearer fields worked toward exhaustion, so that the very concentration that made the town great strained the country that held it. The trade that was the other support of the place was shifting at the same time, the roots and the gathering points of the gold and the ivory drawing northward toward the Zambezi, where new centers were rising, the power of Mutapa gathering to itself, the forwarding of the wealth that had before run through the plateau town, so that the long roads that had filled the elite grounds with beads and porcelain carried less and less toward the old center as the generations passed. There may have been a run of drier years laid over these slower strains, the single wet season failing or thinning across a stretch of seasons, so that the grass and the grain and the water all fell short at once, pressing a settlement already stretched past the point where it could hold its numbers in one place. Though the evidence for any single climatic blow is thinner than the evidence for the slow exhaustion of grazing and trade. Whatever the weighting of the causes, the answer the people found was the old answer of the plateau, the moving on to new ground, the dispersing of the great gathering into smaller settlements on other granite hills, where the grazing was fresh and the woodland uncut and the soils unworked, and the masonry tradition went with them, the same dry stone building rising at other centers as the old one emptied. The pattern was one the plateau had already shown, for the older center at Mapungubwe to the south had risen and held and emptied in much the same way a century or two before Great Zimbabwe reached its height, the seat of wealth and rule shifting across the high country as grazing and trade and the standing of dynasties moved, so that the emptying of the great valley was a turn in a long sequence rather than a singular ending. The stone-building tradition did not die with the town, but traveled with the people who left it, the dry stone walling rising at the centers that succeeded it, at the seats of the Mutapa state to the north, and at the later center of the Torwa and the Rosvi to the southwest. The same coursed granite and the same enclosing of authority continuing for 2 centuries and more after the great valley had quieted, so that the masonry of Great Zimbabwe stands at the center and not the end of a way of building. The court and the gathering of authority moved north with the trade toward Mutapa and toward the rising powers of the later centuries, so that the line of rule and the forwarding of the gold found new seats, and the plateau went on, its people and its cattle and its stone building continuing, while the particular greatness of the one valley between the hill and the open ground passed. The emptying was not the end of a people, but the end of a place's primacy, the dispersal of a concentration that had grown beyond what its country could carry, and the granite walls were left standing over grounds where the daga houses fell slowly back into the soil they had been built from, and the grass came up between the courses. No record from within the town tells the order or the feeling of this leaving, for the people kept their account in ways the ground does not hold, and what remains is the settlement thinning in the archaeology, the last imported wares growing fewer, the daily debris ceasing to accumulate, the great walls passing out of use as the center of an order and standing on as stone alone. The site was not destroyed. It was no longer occupied as it had been, the wealth and the rule, and the people drawn off to other ground, and the valley that had held the largest stone town of the southern continent went quiet under its granite, the walls standing whole and empty over the returning grass. The walls still stand. The outer wall of the great enclosure still curves around its great rough circle on the valley floor, standing in its highest stretch above 9 meters, the chevron band still clear along the top of its finest run, the longest and largest single ancient structure in the southern half of the continent, and within it the conical tower still rises solid and smooth and without entrance from the inner ground, worn at its summit, but holding its tapering form. On the hill above, the oldest walls still wind among the boulders, closing the clefts and screening the high enclosures, the stepped paths still climbing through the rock to the grounds where the carved birds once stood. And from the summit, the same wide country opens as it always did, the woodland and the grassland and the other granite domes standing out of it toward the horizons. The carved soapstone birds, taken from the site in the years of colonial collecting and carried away to distant museums and private hands, have for the most part come back, returned to the country and held now near the place they were made, the figures whose form joins the bird and the ancestor standing again on the ground of the town they once overlooked. The site is studied through the things that endured, the masonry read in its phases from the rough early coursing to the assured high curving walls of the central period, the imported beads and the porcelain and the celadon and the Kilwa coin, dating the reach of the trade, the daga floors and hearths surviving where fire hardened them, the radiocarbon dates anchoring the growth of the town across the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries and its thinning in the 15th. The daga houses themselves are gone, returned to the granite soil they were puddled from, so that the spaces the stone enclosed stand open now to the grass and the sky, the walls defining grounds that no longer hold the thatched houses and the molded floors and the banked hearths of the households that gave them their meaning. The name of the place was taken in the 20th century for the country that grew up around it, so that a modern nation carries the name of the stone town. And the standing bird of the soapstone carvings was raised onto the flag. The emblem of the old center made the emblem of the new state, the past of the granite walls carried forward into the identity of the living country. Archaeology has set aside the long denials of the colonial period, the claims that the walls must have been the work of distant builders, and has established beyond argument what the masonry and the dates and the whole sequence of the material always showed, that the town was built and held and ruled by the people of the plateau, an African city raised by African builders in African stone. The early years of that archaeology did the site harm as well as service. The first diggers of the colonial period, turning over the deposits of the enclosures in search of gold and of confirmation for their theories, carrying off the soapstone birds and disturbing the layers that later and more careful work would have read, so that some of what the ground held was scattered before it could be recorded. And the patient reconstruction of the town's sequence has had to be built around the damage. The careful excavation of the 20th century, the reading of the masonry styles and the stratified imports and the radiocarbon dates restored the true account, anchoring the rise of the town in local hands across the centuries from about 1100 and its height in the 13th and 14th, and the site stands now under protection as a place of world inheritance, its walls surveyed and conserved, its history taught as the achievement it was. The place gives its name now to a whole class of sites, the dry stone enclosures of the plateau called Zimbabwe's after it, the word itself drawn from the houses of stone, so that the single great valley has lent its name to a tradition and to a nation and to the carved bird that stands for both. What we have measured, the walls surveyed and the courses recorded, and the imported wares catalogued and the dates fixed, the growth and the height and the emptying of the town read out of the ground in the patient accumulation of evidence, and the pattern of it stands plain in the granite courses. The granite holds the warmth of the day into the evening as it always did, the long light going gold along the great curving wall and the chevron band and the tower, and then drawing up and off the stone as the sun goes down behind the western domes, the cold of the night settling into the valley, the walls standing gray and whole and quiet over the returning grass. The site is still there. The city is not, and the stone town stands into the dusk over its valley between the hill and the open ground. The courses holding their lines through the centuries since the households dispersed, the walls keeping the shape of an order that the people carried away with them, gray and unhurried and held by the granite, as the light goes off the plateau and the night comes down.